one of the most important things, having done this for 23 years, is that it's really easy to get discouraged and to believe in yourself, because you don't want anybody else to tell you who you are and what you're going to do.
I am going to go ahead and introduce this lovely lady with me today. Fern Schumer Chapman is self-published as well as a traditionally published author. She has a wealth of knowledge and experience on both sides. So she is here today to talk with us about the differences between self-publishing, the pros and cons, what she loves about self-publishing, where are some of the challenges, and also on the traditional publishing side of things as well. And I was fortunate enough to meet Fern when she found me and started working with me in a mentoring relationship. And it has been just such a pleasure working with you, Fern. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks. Well, as you know, April, I'm thrilled to work with you, and you have helped me enormously with this whole process of independent self-publishing. I actually know a lot more about traditional publishing because that's where I was for a very long time. And only in the last 10 years or so have I switched over, although I'm still straddling both worlds. So I actually have a current proposal out to a New York house, and this is true for most authors. They tend to go back to the same house that has published them. So my publisher in New York has been Viking Penguin, and they did a couple of my books. And I also have a young adult book, which is traditionally published. And then many of my other books, for a variety of reasons, which I can tell you why, are independently published.
So tell us a little bit more about your author journey. Where did this start for you, and how did you get started writing? Did you always think you had to go the traditional route? Give us the beginning of your journey here.
Well, to answer your last point first, there was no independent route when I started. I was a journalist. I worked for national magazines as well as the Chicago Tribune, where I live in Chicago. And I thought I'd stay in journalism, really. But something in my personal life happened, which I'll explain to you, and that completely changed my life. So let me give you a little bit of background about my personal life, which led to my traditionally published books. My mother was a Holocaust refugee. She came to this country as an unaccompanied minor when she was only 12 years old. The way she coped with her losses, which included the murder of her parents, is she never spoke of her history. And this created this very black hole in my own identity. I had no idea who she was, and as a result, who I was. There was nobody to cross-reference her. I had never met anybody aside from her sister who actually knew the family. And of course, there were just so few relatives as well. Well, I grew up without any sense of myself and got married, had 2 sons. And when I was pregnant with my 3rd child, my mother came to me out of the blue and said, I want to go back to my town in Germany. This was a very small town. There were 2,000 people and only 2 Jewish families. The family had lived in this town 200 years. Even though I was 6 months pregnant, I realized this was a remarkable opportunity and I couldn't pass it up. And so against doctor's orders, I boarded the plane with my mother and we went on this trip. When I was in this town, I started to realize I had this very unique window on this experience because the town was so small. The people in the town had a range of reactions, from begging us for forgiveness to absolutely denying that they knew anything about the Holocaust. The more important part of the story, not just the legacy of the Holocaust in Germany, was what happened between my mother and me. And what essentially happened is it transformed our relationship because she finally opened up about her own memories and her own experiences and her family. When I got back home, I recognized I had to write this. And so I wrote my first book, which is still in print. It was published in 2000 by Viking Penguin, and it's called Motherland, A Mother-Daughter Journey to Reclaim the Past. It's a memoir that captures 2 trips that we took back to this little town in Germany. So that's what got me started in a new direction. And I abandoned journalism at that time and switched to books.
So did you have some journalism contacts that helped you kind of understand how to get traditionally published? Was that a long journey for you?
Yes, I did have one contact. Now that you remind me, I was working at Northwestern as a adjunct lecturer, and there was a man there whose name was Dan Coyle. And Dan had written a book about a baseball team at Cabrini Green. And I told him this long story that I just told you. And he said, well, I'm going to give you my agent. Sure enough, he did give me his agent, who turned out to be David Black. And David Black kind of strung me along for a very long time. And finally, after about 8 months of this, he calls me up and he says, I'm just too busy to take on your book right now, but I'll give you another agent. And I said, oh, okay. I said, why are you so busy? I mean, what? He says, well, I have really big books. And I said, oh, well, what's your big book? And he said, Tuesdays with Maury. So he handed me off to my agent. And actually, I've been with her for 23 years.
Pat's asking, how many queries did you send out for this book? Were you able to get that inside track? Did you have to do the querying with this first one?
Well, because I had the recommendation from Dan Coyle for David Black, they loved the story, and I was able to at least have a foot in the door. And then David Black handed me to Marion Young, who's my current agent, and she did all of the querying for the book, the memoir Motherland. And actually, we had quite a bit of interest, and we almost had an auction on the book because it's just such a unique story.
That's a different process than what others might see that they would have to go through if they wanted to be traditionally published. How does that look? Because I know you're querying now for new books. Could you kind of give us an overview of what it's like and what the process is to query and go through that process of traditional publishing?
Sure. Well, if you are going to pursue traditional publishing, you have to have an agent. I think you can submit some children's books to publishing houses in New York without an agent, but not adult books. If you're writing a novel, have to complete the entire book. I was able to write a proposal for Motherland on the basis of an overview, 4 chapters, a market evaluation, a biography, that sort of thing. The key is to get an agent. Now, there are lots of agents out there. They won't necessarily sell your book. A lot of them are not worth your time and effort. So you can certainly research in the literary marketplace or some sort of agent organization or website to find somebody who might be interested in your work. The way you can get an agent, and this is often recommended, is if you find a similar book and you look in the acknowledgments, then you know somebody, because usually authors acknowledge their agents, then you know an agent who might have an interest in your work. Now, I came to Marion pretty early on, and I've stayed with Marion, so I haven't had to query other agents, and I wouldn't be inclined to do it because I have such a long relationship with her, and she understands me and my work, and it's been a very productive connection. So I'm not inclined to do that. But I know there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time and spin their wheels trying to find an agent.
Do you have any insight you can share, Fern, around how to find a good agent and what to look out for? Because you said there are some out there that aren't really worth the time. How do you know?
There are a lot of websites that vet this sort of thing. So I would encourage some of you to look online. That's why I mentioned the acknowledgments, because obviously somebody who is celebrating their agent in an acknowledgement is recognizing that they've been solid. Word of mouth. I would ask around. Somebody who's been to more agents than I have.
Right. So tell us about the benefits. What are the good things about traditional publishing? And then we can kind of go through some of the challenges as well.
Well, the good thing about traditional publishing is that obviously you get an advance, and that helps pay your bills while you're working on the book. And you can look this up, but some advances have decreased substantially. Everybody seemed to have written a book during COVID, so it's gotten a lot more challenging to get a decent advance. The advance also is a reflection of how much a publisher is going to invest in the marketing of the book. So in other words, if they don't put a lot of money into it, they're probably not going to be deeply invested in market the book hard. And that is a disappointment, because you put all this time and energy into something that's close to your heart, and suddenly you discover that they're just not, they're using it as a tax write-off, which is a pretty devastating possibility.
So other than the advance, how do you find the whole timeline and working with those folks?
So then you're assigned to an editor. And just to be clear on this, you get a third upfront of the advance, a third upon submitting the manuscript, and then a third upon acceptance of the book. I mean, that's roughly the contract. The agent pretty much bows out after you have an editor, because you're working with that editor to get the book out. Now, again, depends on who you work with. My last book, which I did get a very significant advance for, the editor worked really hard on it to make it excellent. And we got a lot of exposure on places like today.com and Psychology Today and USA Today. All sorts of big publications featured the work. And that is the beauty. If you have the support of a publisher, they will handle a lot of the marketing for you. But there are a lot of books that are traditionally published and the publisher does very little marketing. And that can be very frustrating as well. So if you're thinking, oh, I want to go the traditional route because I'm going to escape the marketing piece, no, it's not going to happen.
So there's a certain amount of marketing that happens, but they really do expect authors to kind of pick it up, work with them on marketing, and then kind of take it over. Once they're done, right? Right.
So my first book was published 23 years ago by Viking Penguin, and my most recent book was published by Viking Penguin in 2021. And there was a pretty big difference. Unfortunately, what happened for me is my paperback came out September of 2001. So obviously I ran right into a very huge American tragedy, and nobody was talking about anything but that. So that was kind of tricky in terms of getting the word out on the book. The reason I mentioned that to you is so much of it is timing.
The one thing I love about self-publishing that strikes me as very difficult on traditional publishing is getting published quickly, right? What is the typical timeline to get published? It seems years, not months.
Well, what I wanted to say is the difference between the amount of money they were investing in marketing in 2001 and 2021 is pretty drastically changed. I did get a lot of support from Viking Penguin for my most recent book, but they gave me a big advance, so they needed to earn back that advance. But I don't think a lot of books today get a lot of support, is what I'm trying to say. So, yeah, you're absolutely right, April. If you want to get a book out quickly, you do not want to publish traditionally. I think in the case of my most recent book, which is called Brother, Sister, Stranger, Sibling Estrangement, and the Road to Reconciliation. I think I sold this book in 2019, and it did come out in 2021. So that gives you, it was about a 3-year process. Typically, they're not agile. They cannot get a book out in under a year.
And I've heard before, I know it was different for you, but I've heard it can take up to 10 years to break into traditional publishing between finding the right people and shopping the different manuscripts and going through that. And when I think about everything that we can do in 10 years self-publishing, it just seems crazy to me to go through such a long wait. But that doesn't mean that you can't have, like you did, Fern, 2 different routes, some traditional and some self-published books. What made you go in that direction?
Well, I'll tell you about that in a second, but I did want to say that one of the things that struck me about your services is that you do much more data work than the publishing houses. So I sometimes feel like, wow, I just wish that they would put April on the keywords, because they would actually get more sales if they would do the work. But a lot of the traditional publishing houses are not that savvy with Amazon ads and keywords and SEOs or whatever. So yeah, it's frustrating to kind of be on both sides of it. So I think your question was why I decided to independently publish some of these books. Mm-hmm. So I told you a little bit about Motherland, the first memoir. It led to a series of events. And these events happened quickly, and I wanted the books out quickly. And I'll show you a few of them. But I also wanted to control the creativity of these books. So, and the look of these books. So, for example, the most remarkable book in this series, which April's been helping me with, I call this the Legacy of the Holocaust series. The most remarkable of these books is that students read my young adult historical novel about my mother's experience as an unaccompanied minor coming from Germany to the United States, and her adjustment to the teenage life and the American culture in the 1940s. And I give a lot of school speeches about this book. Well, I was at one of the schools, and the kids had read this book, Is It Night or Day? And one of the girls stood up and asked me, what happened to Edith's best friend, Gerda Katz? Well, Gerda Katz and Edith were 2 unaccompanied minors who had become best friends on the ship together. And they bonded so deeply that they both felt that if they could only stay together, they would be fine. Well, anyway, long story short, Gerda did not know where she was going to be living. My mother gave Gerda her address. Gerda lost her address, and the 2 lost touch with each other. So when this girl in this class asked me, I said, well, I did try to look, but she probably got married, and I didn't really know who I was looking for. Well, long story short, that school made it a class project to locate and reunite these 2 friends who hadn't seen each other in 72 years. The Oprah Winfrey Network got wind of this, and they captured this remarkable reunion of these 2 friends 72 years after they last saw each other. And then they brought here's the pictures of the reunion. And these are all from the Oprah Winfrey Network. If you're interested in seeing part of it, it's actually on my website, some of the most dramatic moments from the reunion. So you go to fernschumerchapman.com and see it there. And then they brought the 2 ladies back to the school to meet the kids who had changed their lives. This became a model, like Finding My Twin, for service learning projects. In other words, what can students do in the classroom to reach out into the community and change lives? And so schools use this book for that model. And I really wanted to do this in a way that the pictures and the copy would come to life. So, for example, in the history section, you can see we really use, that's my grandfather next to the cucumbers. He was a leader in the town for introducing the cucumber as a cash crop. And as you can see here, obviously darker times as Hitler came to power. But then we did other wonderful things, like we showed exactly how the kids figured out where Gerda was and located her. And it shows you their research. And finally, of course, the last part is the wonderful experience of these two women being reunited. So I wanted to use those photographs. I had a lot of wonderful pictures and documents and historical documents and primary source material. So that is what I did with all three of these books, and they all capture different parts of the experience that I've had, and they're all based or rooted in motherland.
And so how long did it take you to self-publish those three books?
Not that long. It was a completely different deal. I found a designer and we were able to get these books together, I'd say about 8 months each.
Wow.
And we're talking from writing to completion, which is, of course, they're very different in that, here I'll show you, this is another one of them. This is one about the town installing memorial stones to remember my mother's family. So, this kind of thing. And here you see the last picture of the family together. And on your left, or this picture with the roses, those are the memorial stones. So we were able to work together, the designer and I, to produce these books. And they got picked up by the Junior Library Guild. So that never happens, where an independently published book gets picked up by a national important organization like the Junior Library Guild. So
amazing. That is fantastic. And when you think about how quickly you were able to do this, the other thing that you said that I hang on to is the control, right? Because I know I'm a control freak. I say it all the time to my students. I want control over everything, and I want to pick who I work with. I want to pick what it looks like. I want to be involved in the cover design. It sounds like that's exactly the experience that you had with these three books.
Yes. And there's something really profoundly rewarding about controlling the whole creative experience.
Right.
I don't have to fight with anybody about the title. It's just a really fulfilling aspect of independent publishing. I wanted to mention one other book that I've done independently, and you've been working with me on this one. And actually, some of April's people recreated the cover. And I have to say, ever since we improved the cover, it has been moving a lot faster. This is a workbook for those who are estranged from siblings. So it's like a writing journal. And I do two things in here. I actually write a blog for psychologytoday.com. And so I've compiled some of those blogs in here. And then I ask questions at the end of each chapter so that you can begin the process through writing of understanding your feelings. A lot of people don't want to go to therapists. So these therapy notebooks are very successful. And this has done quite well. And I'm thrilled that I did it independently, because I'd hate to see the bulk of the money coming in on this book going to a publisher. And that's something we didn't talk about, but I get a much larger piece of the action when I independently publish.
On the downside, tell us about what about self-publishing has been a challenge for you?
I have a unique distribution channel, and that is that I give lots of speeches in the schools. And I can send order forms home to students, and every school I go to, there is a pile of orders for books. So that's an organic, natural channel of distribution. If you don't have something like that, it's very hard to get past all the relatives who might buy your book. And that might be 200 people, unless you're going to work hard at marketing and really hit the influencers and the podcasts. But it's not easy to get the word out. Now, I have done extremely well, in part because I write a blog for psychologytoday.com. So this is, like I said, a compilation of those blog posts. But every time I write a blog post, I notice the orders go up. Now, I want to say one other thing now that I'm singing April's praises. The book, Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, April looked at this online and said, it's a beautiful cover, but as a little thumbnail, you can't see it. And, I have no power to change that because the publishing house owns the rights to this book. And that's really frustrating at times. As you know, April, we've talked about that. I can't do anything about that. I'd love to change the cover, and I think we probably do better, especially after my experience with Sibling Estrangement Journal.
Tennille says, comparing traditional publishing and self-publishing, what was the most successful marketing tool, or which tool worked better in the different publishing methods?
Well, let me say first that you need to be really careful when hiring marketing people. There are a lot of people out there who would love to take your money, and they don't deliver much for your thousands of dollars. So I would warn you all about that. Obviously, everybody's trying to get into the national press or the big podcasts or something, some way to distinguish yourself and to make the audience aware of the books. One thing that was very helpful for me with Motherland was it became a book club book. So one book club after another started to read it, and that was huge word of mouth. There are different organizations that serve the independent bookstores, like Book Sense 76. And if you're one of their picks, that gives you a leg up as well, because basically they are writing to each other in a newsletter or online and saying, hey, these are the books we are pushing for this season. And actually, Motherland got a lot of support from not only the independent booksellers, but also it was a Barnes & Noble Discover New Great Writers book long before it was this big of a program. But that helped a lot. I mean, if you can find a distinguishing label or identifier or award, that helps enormously.
What kind of marketing did you have to do to get your book for consideration for these things?
Well, that was Motherland, and it was traditionally published. So the publisher did most of the work there. I've tried to do some of it on my own, and it's hard to get their ear. Nonetheless, I think if you have a relationship with a local bookstore and you can start there, you could probably lean on them to get the word out as well. I mean, a lot of it is like anything else. It's networking.
And you mentioned school visits being very good for you. So focusing on school visits, do you also do events and conferences and things like that, Fern?
I do, although I've gotten pickier about what I'll do. So, for example, a lot of these libraries have these author events where you get to tell your story 400 times. It's a very inefficient way to sell books. Maybe you sell 10 books and you've told your story and lost your voice after 400 repeats. So I don't do any of those anymore. I became really weary of that. I don't have the time to sit all day at that kind of event. So, there's this whole concept of how to market. And I think this was very helpful to me. If you think of it like a food chain, you want to go higher and higher on the food chain because that's much more efficient in terms of getting the word out. So what do I mean by that? Well, I don't want to market to every reader. I would much rather market to a book club. Or even better, I'd rather market to a library that's telling the book clubs what to read, and higher and higher and higher. And so one book, one community. I've been selected for several one book, one community book clubs. And that's huge because every book club in the community is reading that book. So what I'm trying to say is that you want to go for the highest people, the highest gatekeeper you can get.
Have you had any of your self-published works selected by book clubs?
Only the Junior Library Guild, which is its own book club, and it identifies the best books of the season. No, I mean, it's definitely harder to market these books that are independently published. Now, having said that, as I was saying before, my blog on Psychology Today has enormously helped to sell this. And it's a new book, so it's still just getting its feet under it. But I feel like April and I have talked about this, that of all the independently published books that I've done, this one has the most potential because it falls into the self-help category.
You're starting to see some traction, and going in and doing those Amazon ads has really helped moving things forward as well. What kind of advice do you have for those authors that are brand new and, trying to query traditional publishers or anything? Are there specific places that or resources or places that you would recommend that they check out first in order to kind of break into traditional publishing?
So if you're going to go the route of traditional publishing, there are organizations, particularly for children's books, like the Society of, let's see if I'm going to get this right, SCBWI, and they offer a lot of programming and help with reaching agents and editors at traditional houses. Somebody wrote in the chat box that some of these conferences are very helpful. Absolutely. I mean, I think what April's doing for independent publishing, organizations like the Society of Children's Books Writers and Illustrators is doing for the traditional side. So I would encourage those of you who want to do a children's book to join organizations like that and participate in their programs and find the community there, which is very supportive.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Alliance of Independent Authors as well?
I don't know that one.
I remember they have a big guide full of providers and resources. And I did see a number of like agents and other things like that, although I could be confusing that with the SCBWI, because I'm involved in that IBPA, which is the Independent Book Publishers Association as well, IBPA.org. They have a lot of great resources there as well. Conferences, getting in front of those places where these individuals are going to be, it's really important. And like you said, networking and finding other people who have broken in and trying to understand and get references and recommendations. It all comes back to networking, doesn't it?
It comes back to networking and really having passion for what you're working on, because that comes through. You can feel it, you can see it. One of the most important things, having done this for 23 years, is that it's really easy to get discouraged and to believe in yourself, because you don't want anybody else to tell you who you are and what you're going to do.
I agree. And I would add to that to get yourself into an author community that is going to be supportive and work with you and, cheer you on and provide you with some resources, feedback. Those kinds of communities are very hard to come by, but I invite you to join my Learn to Self-Publish group. There is just something magical that happens in a community of authors all working together to publish their books. It's just magical.
And the other thing I would add is to try to find a really good editor who can help you.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm sure all of you are aware that when I first did some of these self-published books, people were scornful about the idea. And now it's celebrated. So, it's part of a trend. And the truth is, and this is a terrible thing to say, but traditional New York houses are too big and slow. And if you have a timely book, it's almost impossible to get it out through those houses.
Fern, why don't you tell us a little bit more about where we can find out more about your books and you and the speaking that you do?
Everything is at my website, which I think somebody put up here, www.fernschumerchapman.com. And there you can find out about the speeches, All the books are featured there. You'll read reviews and testimonials, and you can see that part of the Oprah tape that captures the reunion of my mother and Gerda Katz 72 years after they saw each other. So a lot of the material is available through there.
And what can we do to help support your efforts? And thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Well, if any of you have an interest in any of these books, as you know, as an author, we're always trying to sell them. So Sibling Estrangement, which real quickly, Brother, Sister, Strangers is a memoir, as well as the social science behind sibling estrangement. And I include many other people who are suffering as well. Motherland captures 2 trips back to Germany. And of course, I told you a little bit about that one and how unique that story was. After my mother got here, I learned the program. After our trips, I learned the program that brought her to America. It was a little-known program organized by Lutherans, Quakers, and Jewish groups. They brought over 10 children at a time between 10 children at a time, 100 a year, between 1934 and 45. They saved 1,400 kids, and these kids are now known as the 1,000 children. My mother is one of the 1,000 children, and this book captures that immigration experience. I told you about Finding My Twin, which is about the reunion of the 2 old friends. Stumbling on History captures my mother's and my trip in 2014 to attend the ceremony to install the stones in the little town. And then finally, the last one in this group is 3 Stars in the Night Sky. This is Gerda's story. Her family got out in 1941, which was unheard of. And they got out through a little-known program in the Dominican Republic. But she was in Seattle. So this captures their experience of being separated and then reunited.
You've got a huge volume of work there, and it is amazing. So for those of you that are watching this live or on replay, feel free to check out the books, share. It always helps when you talk about things and share with others, and that helps us spread the word and support these fantastic speakers that come in to share with us. Thank you so much again, Fern, for your expertise and sharing today.
Thank you. And April, thank you for all you do for traditional as well as self-published authors, and all in one.
You're welcome. Take care. Bye, everybody. Have a wonderful
Bye.
night.